The gas lamps flickered against the November frost as Kate Webster's hands trembled around the copper pot. Steam rose from the bubbling contents, casting dancing shadows across the kitchen walls of 2 Mayfield cottages. Outside, the Holloway road lay silent beneath a veil of fog, unaware that within these walls something unspeakable was dissolving into the night. The clock struck 10:30. Upstairs, Julia Martha Thomas's bedroom remained empty, her evening prayers forever unfinished. The scent of lye and something far more terrible drifted through the house, mingling with the ash from the dying fire. Kate's breathing came in short gasps as she stirred, her mind racing with the weight of what she had done to the woman who had trusted her. In the distance, a church bell tolled across Richmond, its bronze voice carrying over the Thames. The sound seemed to whisper of judgment, of secrets that would soon spill into the gaslit streets like blood on cobblestone. But for now, in this moment suspended between confession and concealment, only the kitchen knew the truth of what had become of the pious widow of Park Road. The pot continued to bubble, patient and methodical in its grim work. Chapter 1. The Widow's Trust. Good evening, and welcome. The night is quiet now, and the world has grown small. Let us drift backward in time to an England where gas lamps flickered against frost-covered windows, and the shadows held secrets that daylight dared not reveal. I am your bedside historian, and tonight we journey to the autumn of 1879, to a tale that would shake the very foundations of Victorian society. Wherever you're listening from tonight, whether nestled beneath warm blankets in London, or perhaps across the ocean in distant lands, whatever the hour may be in your corner of the world, you are welcome here. Before we begin our descent into this dark chapter of history, if you find comfort in these midnight tales, please consider subscribing to our channel. It helps us continue bringing you these stories from the shadows of the past, and I'm deeply grateful for each listener who joins our growing community of historical wanderers. Now, let us step through the veil of time itself, back to the gaslit streets of Victorian Richmond, where the Thames runs dark beneath November skies, and where a widow named Julia Martha Thomas lived her final days in peaceful ignorance of the horror that would soon consume her. The morning of October 28, 1879, dawned cold and grey over Richmond. Frost clung to the windows of Park Road like frozen tears, and the bare branches of elm trees scratched against the pewter sky with skeletal fingers. Within the modest but respectable walls of No. 2 Park Road, Julia Martha Thomas stirred from her slumber as the distant chimes of Richmond Parish Church marked the 7th hour. At 55 years of age, Mrs. Thomas possessed the refined bearing of a woman who had known both comfort and loss. Her late husband, Captain Thomas, had left her with sufficient means to maintain her dignity, though not enough to live in the grand style of Richmond's wealthier residents. Her hair, once golden as summer wheat, had silvered to the colour of winter moonlight, and her hands bore the delicate lines that spoke of a life spent in prayer and quiet contemplation. The widow had established her daily routines with the precision of a clockmaker. Each morning began with prayers before the small crucifix that hung above her bed, followed by a modest breakfast of tea and toast prepared in her own kitchen. She attended morning service at St. Matthias Church when her health permitted, and spent her afternoons in charitable works, visiting the poor and tending to the spiritual needs of those less fortunate than herself. Mrs. Thomas lived simply, but she was not without her small vanities. She took pride in maintaining her home with meticulous care, ensuring that every surface gleamed and every curtain hung in perfect alignment. Her neighbours respected her as a woman of unimpeachable character, devout in her faith and generous in her compassion. She was, by all accounts, the very model of Victorian Christian womanhood. Yet for all her piety and kindness, Julia Martha Thomas harboured one significant weakness. She was perhaps too trusting, too willing to see goodness in others where wariness might have served her better. This charitable nature would prove to be both her greatest virtue and her most fatal flaw. The household at Park Road had grown quiet since the departure of her previous domestic servant some weeks earlier. The girl had left without proper notice, citing family obligations that required her immediate return to Ireland. Mrs. Thomas, though inconvenienced, had accepted the explanation with Christian forgiveness and set about finding suitable replacement help. Richmond in 1879 bustled with the energy of a town caught between its pastoral past and its increasingly suburban future. The railway had brought prosperity and growth, transforming the ancient riverside settlement into a fashionable retreat for London's middle classes. Grand terraces rose along the hillsides, their Georgian elegance testament to the wealth flowing from the great city just 8 miles upstream. Yet beneath this veneer of respectability, darker currents moved. The servant problem, as it was known among Richmond's genteel households, had grown increasingly acute. Young women who might once have considered domestic service a respectable career now sought employment in the expanding factories and shops of London proper. Those who remained in service often proved unreliable, moving from household to household with alarming frequency. The better families competed fiercely for the services of trustworthy domestics, leaving widows of modest means like Mrs. Thomas to make do with whatever help they could secure. It was against this backdrop of domestic uncertainty that Kate Webster entered Julia Thomas's life like a storm cloud gathering on a clear horizon. The introduction came through Mrs. Porter, a neighbouring widow who had employed Kate briefly during the previous spring. Mrs. Porter's recommendation was lukewarm at best, delivered with a sort of careful phrasing that conveyed as much through omission as through direct statement. "She is a strong worker," Mrs. Porter had said, her gloved hands worrying at the edge of her reticule as she stood in Mrs. Thomas's modest parlour. Quite capable in the kitchen and thorough in her cleaning, she does have opinions about how things ought to be done, but then again, many Irish girls possess such independence of spirit. Mrs. Porter's pale eyes had flickered away as she spoke, focusing intently on the small collection of porcelain shepherdesses that adorned Mrs. Thomas's mantelpiece. "I found her service adequate, though I must confess that circumstances required her to seek new employment rather sooner than either of us had anticipated." The delicate phrasing was typical of Victorian discourse, where unpleasant truths were wrapped in layers of euphemism and social courtesy. Mrs. Thomas, her own gentle nature predisposing her to think well of others, accepted the recommendation with grateful enthusiasm. She was, after all, in desperate need of help, and Kate Webster came available immediately. When Kate Webster appeared at the door of No. 2 Park Road on that grey October morning, she presented a figure both imposing and oddly compelling. At 30 years of age, she possessed the robust constitution of the rural Irish, her shoulders broad from years of physical labour, and her hands calloused from countless hours of scrubbing and washing. Her dark hair was pulled back in a severe knot beneath her simple bonnet, and her dress, though clean and mended with careful stitches, spoke of a woman who knew intimately the struggle for respectability on meagre wages. Yet there was something in Kate Webster's eyes that might have given a more worldly observer pause. They held a hardness that seemed at odds with her deferential manner, a calculating quality that flickered behind her respectful expressions like candlelight glimpsed through frosted glass. When she smiled, which she did frequently during that first interview, the warmth never quite reached those watchful eyes. "Indeed, ma'am, I am most grateful for the opportunity to serve in such a respectable household," Kate had said, her Irish accent softened but not entirely suppressed by her years in England. "Mrs. Porter spoke most kindly of your Christian character, and I do hope to prove myself worthy of your trust." The words were perfectly chosen, calculated to appeal to Mrs. Thomas's vanity, while establishing Kate's own credentials as a woman of appropriate moral sensitivity. She spoke of her previous positions with practiced ease, weaving together truth and fiction so seamlessly that even a more suspicious listener might have been convinced. Mrs. Thomas, for her part, was charmed by Kate's apparent devotion to duty and her respectful manner. The widow was also, truth be told, somewhat lonely. Her late husband's relatives lived far away in Devonshire, and her own family connections had grown increasingly tenuous with the passing years. The prospect of having a competent domestic who might also provide occasional companionship held considerable appeal. "The wages will be £12 per year, with board and lodging provided," Mrs. Thomas explained as they concluded their interview in the small parlour. "I expect punctuality in all duties, cleanliness in both person and work, and absolute honesty in all dealings. I am not a harsh mistress, but I do require proper standards to be maintained." Kate Webster nodded solemnly, her expression the very picture of humble gratitude. "You shall find no fault in my service, ma'am. I understand the importance of maintaining a Christian household in the proper manner." And so the arrangement was settled. Kate Webster moved into the tiny servants' room in the basement of Park Road, bringing with her a single worn carpet bag that contained all her worldly possessions. Mrs. Thomas provided the customary advance against wages to allow her new servant to purchase the necessary uniforms and supplies for her position. For the first few weeks of November, the arrangement proceeded smoothly enough. Kate proved herself capable in the kitchen, preparing simple but well-seasoned meals that pleased Mrs. Thomas's modest appetite. She scrubbed the floors until they gleamed, polished the brass fixtures to mirror brightness, and maintained the small garden with diligent attention to detail. Yet even during this honeymoon period, careful observers might have noted certain troubling signs. Kate displayed an unusual familiarity with Mrs. Thomas's personal belongings, examining jewellery and small valuables with an attention that seemed to exceed mere cleaning duties. She asked probing questions about Mrs. Thomas's family connections and financial arrangements, inquiries that she disguised as natural concern for her mistress's welfare. More significantly, Kate began to exhibit a proprietorial attitude toward the household that struck some of the neighbours as presumptuous. When the baker's boy delivered bread each morning, Kate would engage him in lengthy conversations about the neighbourhood's gossip and affairs. She seemed particularly interested in learning about Mrs. Thomas's habits and routines, information that she filed away with the methodical precision of a general planning a campaign. Mrs. Thomas herself remained oblivious to these subtle warning signs. She was pleased with Kate's efficiency and grateful for the companionship that her new servant provided during the long winter evenings. When Kate suggested small economies in household management or offered opinions about neighbourhood affairs, Mrs. Thomas accepted these contributions as evidence of her servant's devotion to the family's interests. The widow had grown accustomed to Kate's presence at the evening meal, a practice that some of her more conventional neighbours might have found inappropriate. Victorian society maintained strict boundaries between employer and servant, but Mrs. Thomas's loneliness and Kate's skillful manipulation had gradually eroded these barriers. Kate would sit at the kitchen table as Mrs. Thomas took her supper in the dining room, but conversation flowed freely between the two rooms. "The weather grows uncommonly cold for November," Mrs. Thomas might observe as she picked at her evening portion of mutton and potatoes. "Indeed it does, ma'am," Kate would reply from her station in the kitchen, "though I'm thinking it may be blessing in disguise, keeping the ruffians and vagabonds close to their own hearths, instead of prowling about decent neighbourhoods." Such exchanges had become routine by late November, part of the comfortable domestic rhythm that Mrs. Thomas had come to appreciate. She felt secure in her choice of servant and grateful for the stability that Kate's presence brought to her previously disrupted household. Winter tightened its grip on Richmond as December approached. The Thames ran black beneath pewter skies, and frost painted intricate patterns on the windows of Park Road each night. Gas lamps flickered against the gathering darkness earlier each day, casting pools of yellow light onto cobblestones that grew treacherous with ice. Within the walls of No. 2 Park Road, Mrs. Thomas maintained her quiet routines, with the assistance of her increasingly indispensable servant. Kate had proven herself not merely competent but genuinely valuable, anticipating her mistress's needs and managing the household with efficiency that impressed even the critical Mrs. Porter. Yet beneath this surface harmony, darker currents were beginning to stir. Kate Webster was not the simple domestic servant she pretended to be. Her past held secrets that would have horrified Mrs. Thomas had she known them, and her future plans would have terrified the trusting widow beyond measure. The woman who scrubbed Mrs. Thomas's floors each morning had once stood in the dock at the Old Bailey, charged with theft and sentenced to transportation. She had served 4 years in the female factory at Parramatta before managing to secure her passage back to England through means that remained deliberately obscure. The character references she had provided were forgeries, skillfully executed but entirely fictitious. More troubling still were Kate's associates in London's criminal underworld. She maintained connections with receivers of stolen goods, forgers of documents, and other practitioners of illegal trades. These relationships provided her with both information about potential targets and means of disposing of property that came into her possession through questionable methods. Mrs. Thomas's modest wealth had not escaped Kate's calculating attention. The widow's jewellery, though not extensive, included several pieces of genuine value inherited from her late mother. Her small collection of silver plate, while hardly impressive by the standards of Richmond's grander households, represented months of wages to a woman in Kate's position. More significantly, Mrs. Thomas maintained a modest but regular income from railway shares left by her late husband, funds that she accessed through monthly visits to her bank in Richmond's commercial district. As December deepened and the year moved toward its close, Kate Webster began to lay the groundwork for what she privately considered her liberation from the drudgery of domestic service. She studied Mrs. Thomas's habits with the attention of a natural historian, noting every detail of the widow's daily routine and filing away information about her financial arrangements and social connections. The plan that gradually took shape in Kate's mind was audacious in its scope and terrifying in its implications. She would not content herself with simple theft, which would inevitably lead to discovery and pursuit. Instead, she envisioned a more permanent solution to her circumstances, one that would provide her with both immediate financial benefit and long-term security from detection. Mrs. Thomas, meanwhile, remained blissfully unaware of the danger gathering beneath her own roof. She looked forward to the Christmas season with quiet anticipation, planning modest celebrations and charitable donations that reflected both her faith and her limited means. She had grown genuinely fond of Kate, appreciating not only her domestic competence, but also her apparent devotion to the household's welfare. The widow had even begun to consider whether she might increase Kate's wages come the new year, a gesture of appreciation for service that exceeded her modest expectations. Such kindness was characteristic of Mrs. Thomas's generous nature, the same trusting spirit that had led her to welcome Kate Webster into her home and her confidence. As the gas lamps flickered against the December frost and the church bells of Richmond marked the passing hours with bronze-voiced precision, the final act of this domestic tragedy moved inexorably toward its appointed climax. The widow's trust would soon collide with her servant's ruthless ambition in a confrontation that would shock Victorian society and leave an indelible stain on the quiet respectability of Park Road. The stage was set, the players positioned, and the terrible machinery of fate prepared to turn with the relentless precision of a clock striking midnight. In her modest home, Julia Martha Thomas continued her prayers and charitable works, never suspecting that death itself had taken up residence beneath her roof, wearing the mask of humble service and speaking in soft Irish cadences of devotion and duty. The November shadows grew longer, and somewhere in the darkness, Kate Webster sharpened her resolve like a blade against a whetstone, counting the days until her patient scheming would finally bear its bitter fruit. Chapter 2. The Widow's Domain. The morning of March 2nd, 1879, arrived with a soft grey light that settled over Richmond like a shroud. Julia Martha Thomas rose from her narrow bed in the upstairs chamber of 2 Mayfield Cottages, her feet touching the cold wooden floor as the first bells of distant churches began their call to Sunday worship. At 55 years of age, she moved with the careful precision of a woman who had learned to navigate the world alone, her widow's weeds rustling in the pre-dawn quiet. The house on Mayfield Cottages stood among a row of modest terraced dwellings, their brick facades weathered by London's perpetual fog and soot. These were homes for the respectable poor, the widowed gentlewomen and retired clerks who maintained their dignity through careful economy and rigid routine. Julia's cottage bore the particular stillness that comes to places where solitary lives unfold in measured cadences, where each day follows the last with the precision of a well-wound clock. Her late husband's portrait gazed down from the mantelpiece in the parlour, his stern Victorian countenance frozen in daguerreotype permanence. John Thomas had been a man of modest means but solid reputation, a clerk in one of London's countless mercantile houses who had provided his wife with the security of respectability if not abundance. His death 3 years prior had left Julia with enough inheritance to maintain her small household, provided she lived with the frugality that had become second nature to women of her station. The cottage itself reflected this careful economy in every corner. The parlour contained her few treasures: a horsehair sofa covered in dark wool, a mahogany table where she took her simple meals, and shelves lined with the devotional books that formed the cornerstone of her daily existence. The kitchen below stairs remained the domain of whatever servant she could afford to employ, while the 2 small bedrooms above provided accommodation for herself and her domestic help. Julia's daily routine had crystallised around the rhythms of morning and faith. Each morning began with prayer at her bedside, her lips moving silently through the familiar words of supplication and gratitude. She would dress herself in the black silk that marked her widowed state, arranging her greying hair with the same meticulous care she had learned as a young bride. The mirror reflected back a face marked by the particular gravity that came to women who had buried their companions and faced the world's indifference with Christian resignation. Her breakfast consisted of tea and bread with a thin spreading of butter, taken at the kitchen table while she planned the day's modest activities. Letters to distant relations occupied much of her correspondence, along with the careful management of household accounts that required constant vigilance to stretch her limited funds across the necessities of genteel existence. The coal merchant's bill, the baker's account, the small sum required for the church collection plate, each expense demanded consideration in the arithmetic of survival. The previous autumn had brought particular challenges to her domestic arrangements. Her long-serving housemaid had departed to marry a carter from Wandsworth, leaving Julia to navigate the uncertain waters of finding suitable help. The quality of servants available to households of modest means had declined considerably in recent years, as factory work and emigration drew away the reliable country girls who had once formed the backbone of domestic service. Through the intervention of her neighbour, Mrs. Porter, Julia had eventually secured the services of Kate Webster, an Irish woman of perhaps 30 years, whose references spoke of experience in households throughout West London. Kate had presented herself as capable and willing, her accent carrying the musical cadences of County Wexford, tempered by years among London's labouring classes. Her appearance suggested the robust health that domestic work demanded: broad shoulders, strong hands, and the weathered complexion of one accustomed to physical exertion. The arrangement had begun with the cautious optimism that marked all such domestic negotiations. Kate would receive her board and lodging along with wages of £12 per annum, a sum that represented careful calculation on Julia's part between necessity and economy. In return, she would manage the cooking, cleaning, and general maintenance of the cottage, allowing Julia to maintain the facade of middle-class respectability that her position demanded. The early weeks of Kate's employment had passed without particular incident. She proved competent in the kitchen, preparing the simple meals that Julia preferred: broths and stews that could stretch modest portions of meat across several days, bread puddings that transformed stale loaves into acceptable desserts, and the endless succession of tea that marked the hours of an English household. Her cleaning was thorough, if not gentle, and she showed proper deference in her interactions with her employer. Yet beneath this surface competence, Julia had begun to detect currents that troubled her ordered world. Kate's manner carried an independence that seemed at odds with proper domestic hierarchy. She expressed opinions on matters beyond her station, commenting on the sermons they heard during their Sunday church attendance and questioning the necessity of certain household economies. Her associations in the neighbourhood appeared to extend beyond the appropriate circles for a domestic servant, and Julia had observed her in conversation with individuals whose respectability seemed questionable. The religious observances that formed the cornerstone of Julia's existence appeared to hold little meaning for her servant. While Kate accompanied her mistress to church services as required, her participation seemed mechanical rather than devotional. She showed no interest in the prayer meetings that Julia attended on Wednesday evenings, nor did she demonstrate familiarity with the scriptural passages that provided comfort and guidance to the widow's daily struggles. More troubling still were the subtle signs of dishonesty that Julia had begun to observe. Small household items occasionally went missing: a silver spoon, a candle, coins from the household fund. Losses that individually seemed insignificant but collectively suggested a pattern of petty theft. When questioned, Kate's explanations carried the smooth plausibility of practiced deception. Yet Julia's experience of managing households had taught her to recognize the signs of servant dishonesty. The social distinctions that governed Victorian domestic life had created a complex web of expectations and resentments within the walls of 2 Mayfield Cottages. Julia maintained the formal distance that her position required, addressing her servant by surname and expecting the proper forms of respect that marked the boundary between employer and employed. Yet the intimacy of their shared living space created tensions that no amount of social protocol could entirely resolve. Kate's background remained largely opaque to her employer, filtered through the conventional discretion that surrounded domestic hiring. She spoke occasionally of previous positions in households throughout London, of families whose names meant nothing to Julia, but whose requirements had apparently shaped Kate's understanding of domestic work. Her personal history before entering service remained unmentioned, as was customary for women whose past circumstances might not bear close examination. The approaching spring of 1879 brought changes to the rhythm of life along the Holloway Road. The harsh winter that had gripped London throughout January and February began its gradual retreat, though the morning still carried the sharp edge of frost that made rising from warm beds an act of determination. The coal fires that heated the cottage demanded constant attention, and the expense of fuel added pressure to Julia's already strained budget. In the wider world beyond Richmond, the engines of empire continued their relentless expansion. News from Afghanistan spoke of military campaigns in distant mountains, while closer to home the great machinery of industrial progress transformed the landscape with railways and factories. Yet within the narrow confines of Julia's existence, these grand movements of history remained as remote as the stars, noticed only when they touched upon the small concerns of daily survival. The church calendar provided the primary structure for measuring time's passage in Julia's ordered world. Lent approached with its familiar call to penitence and reflection, offering the comfort of ritual observance that had sustained her through the difficult years following her husband's death. She planned the modest economies that would mark her devotional practice. Additional restrictions on an already spare diet, increased attendance at prayer services, and the small charitable contributions that her circumstances would permit. The relationship between mistress and servant continued its delicate negotiation of authority and resentment as February drew toward its close. Kate's competence in household management remained beyond question, yet Julia found herself increasingly troubled by aspects of her employee's character that seemed to challenge the proper order of domestic hierarchy. The Irish woman's independence of spirit, while not openly rebellious, carried undertones that made Julia uneasy about the stability of their arrangement. The evening routines that concluded each day had settled into predictable patterns. Julia would retire to the parlour after the evening meal, occupying herself with needlework or devotional reading, while Kate completed the cleaning duties in the kitchen below. The sound of dishware being washed and surfaces being scrubbed provided a domestic symphony that spoke of order, maintained against the chaos that always threatened to overwhelm households of limited means. As the flames died down in the grate and the cottage settled into the quiet of another evening, Julia could not have imagined that the careful routine of her existence stood poised on the edge of an abyss that would swallow her entire world. The woman moving about the kitchen below, whose competent hands had prepared countless meals and maintained the modest comfort of their shared dwelling, carried within her heart the seeds of destruction that would soon bloom into horror beyond imagination. The clock in the parlour marked the passing hours with mechanical precision, each tick bringing them closer to a moment when the careful fabric of respectability and routine would tear apart to reveal the darkness that lay beneath the surface of ordinary life. Chapter 3. The Weight of Secrets. The morning of March 3rd, 1879, arrived with a peculiar stillness that seemed to hang over Richmond like a shroud. The Thames moved sluggishly beneath a pewter sky, its waters reflecting the grey light that filtered through the industrial haze settling over London's expanding suburbs. Along Park Road, the respectable Victorian houses stood sentinel in their neat rows, their windows dark behind heavy curtains, their inhabitants still lost in the last hours of sleep before the working week began anew. At number 2, Mayfield Cottages, however, sleep had become a stranger to Kate Webster. The Irish servant moved through the rooms like a spectre, her movements sharp and deliberate, driven by a desperate energy that had sustained her through the darkest hours of the night. The copper pot had long since been emptied and scrubbed clean, its contents disposed of in ways that would haunt the neighbourhood for generations to come. Yet the weight of what had transpired in that kitchen pressed down upon her shoulders like a millstone, growing heavier with each passing moment. The house itself seemed to bear witness to the terrible transformation that had occurred within its walls. The very air felt different, charged with an electricity that made Kate's skin crawl. Every creak of the floorboards, every whistle of wind through the window frames seemed to carry an accusation. The familiar domestic sounds that had once provided comfort now felt like the whispers of the dead, and Kate found herself starting at shadows that hadn't existed the day before. Mrs. Thomas's bedroom remained exactly as she had left it on that final evening. The bed was neatly made, its white cotton sheets pulled taut in the military fashion that the widow had preferred. Upon the mahogany dressing table, a silver-backed hairbrush lay beside a small leather-bound Bible, its pages worn smooth by years of devoted reading. The wardrobe stood slightly ajar, revealing the modest collection of black dresses that had comprised the widow's wardrobe since her husband's passing 3 years prior. Kate avoided that room as much as possible, but when necessity forced her to enter, she felt the strangest sensation that she was being watched. The daguerreotype of Mr. Thomas, displayed prominently on the mantelpiece, seemed to follow her with his stern gaze as if the long-dead merchant somehow knew what had befallen his beloved wife. The religious prints that adorned the walls took on an accusatory quality in the grey morning light, their biblical scenes of judgment and redemption serving as silent reminders of the divine justice that Kate had been raised to fear. The practical concerns of concealment, however, demanded immediate attention. Mrs. Thomas was known throughout the neighbourhood as a creature of strict routine, attending morning service at St. Matthias Church every Sunday without fail, and taking her weekly shopping expeditions to Richmond's bustling market square each Wednesday. Her absence would soon be noted by the shopkeepers who had served her faithfully for years, and by the fellow congregants who nodded respectfully when she took her customary pew in the third row from the front. Kate's mind raced with possibilities and fabrications, each more elaborate than the last. She could claim that her employer had been called away suddenly to tend to a sick relative in Ireland. The story had a certain plausibility, as Mrs. Thomas had occasionally mentioned distant cousins in County Cork whom she had never met but felt obligated to remember in her prayers. Alternatively, she might suggest that the widow had decided to take an extended holiday to Brighton, seeking the restorative powers of sea air that Victorian physicians so often prescribe for nervous disorders. Yet even as Kate rehearsed these deceptions, she understood their fundamental weakness. Mrs. Thomas was not a woman given to spontaneous departures or frivolous expenditures. Her neighbours knew her as a model of propriety and predictability, a widow who had found solace in routine after the chaos of grief. Any sudden change in her behaviour would invite scrutiny, and scrutiny was precisely what Kate could not afford. The financial implications of her crime began to weigh heavily upon Kate's consciousness as the morning progressed. Mrs. Thomas's modest household budget had been managed with the precision of a bank ledger, every penny accounted for and allocated according to her careful calculations. Kate had access to the household funds, of course, but she knew that larger expenditures required documentation and justification. The widow's solicitor, Mr. Menhennet of Richmond High Street, would expect regular reports on the management of the estate, and Mrs. Thomas's bank would notice any unusual withdrawals from her account. The servants' quarters, where Kate had made her temporary home, felt increasingly like a prison cell as the hours crept by. The narrow bed where she had once found rest now seemed to mock her with its lumpy mattress and thin blankets. The small window that looked out over the garden offered no comfort, only a view of the bare branches of the apple tree where Mrs. Thomas had once hung laundry to dry in the summer sun. The very walls seemed to close in around her, their faded wallpaper peeling at the edges like accusations waiting to be voiced. Kate's thoughts turned inevitably to escape, but even this avenue presented seemingly insurmountable challenges. Her wages from Mrs. Thomas had been modest but regular, allowing her to save only a few pounds over the months of her employment. Without references or recommendations, finding new position would prove nearly impossible, particularly if word of her sudden departure began to circulate among Richmond's network of domestic servants and their employers. The Victorian household staff formed a tight-knit community where reputation was everything, and scandal travelled faster than the morning milk delivery. The physical evidence of her crime presented another source of constant anxiety. Despite her efforts at concealment and disposal, Kate knew that traces remained scattered throughout the house like breadcrumbs leading back to her guilt. The kitchen bore the subtle signs of her midnight activities, despite her frantic attempts at cleaning. The scullery drain carried scents that no amount of carbolic acid seemed capable of completely eliminating. Even the garden, with its freshly disturbed earth near the chicken coop, told a story that any observant eye might read with growing horror. As the afternoon shadows began to lengthen across Park Road, Kate found herself drawn repeatedly to the front windows, peering through the lace curtains at the quiet street beyond. The neighbourhood children had begun their walk home from school, their voices carrying on the crisp March air as they skipped along the pavement. Mrs. Henderson from number 4 emerged to collect her post, nodding pleasantly to young Tommy Morrison as he delivered the afternoon newspapers. The mundane rituals of suburban life continued with their usual clockwork precision, oblivious to the terrible secret that festered behind the respectable facade of the Mayfield Cottages. The weight of solitude pressed down upon Kate with increasing force as the day wore on. She had become accustomed to Mrs. Thomas's presence, even when they disagreed about household matters or the widow's exacting standards. The constant criticism and demands had been irritating, certainly, but they had also provided a structure and purpose to Kate's days. Now, surrounded by the silence of the empty house, she felt the full magnitude of her isolation. She was alone with her secret, alone with her guilt, and alone with the growing certainty that her carefully constructed world was beginning to crumble around her. The evening brought fresh terrors as the gas lamps began to flicker to life along the street. Kate found herself unable to light the lamps within the house, fearing that their glow might somehow attract unwanted attention or reveal evidence that had escaped her notice in the daylight hours. Instead, she moved through the darkening rooms like a ghost, stumbling over furniture that had become suddenly unfamiliar, starting at every sound that penetrated the walls from the world outside. The grandfather clock in the hallway continued its relentless marking of time, each chime a reminder that every passing hour brought her closer to discovery. Mrs. Thomas had been particularly proud of that clock, purchased from a clockmaker in Kew Gardens shortly after her marriage. Its brass pendulum caught the last rays of daylight filtering through the transom window, creating dancing shadows on the hallway walls that seemed to take on sinister shapes in Kate's increasingly agitated state of mind. Sleep, when it finally came, brought no relief from the torment that had consumed her waking hours. Her dreams were filled with accusations and phantoms, with copper pots that bubbled eternally and church bells that tolled with voices of the damned. She woke repeatedly throughout the night, her nightgown soaked with perspiration, despite the March chill that had settled over the house. Each time she drifted back into unconsciousness, the nightmares returned with renewed intensity, as if her guilty conscience had taken permanent residence in her sleeping mind. The dawn of March 4th brought with it the terrible realization that she could not remain in the house indefinitely. Mrs. Thomas's routine absences had limits, and questions would soon be asked by neighbours, tradesmen, and the various officials who comprised the administrative structure of Victorian suburban life. The postman would wonder about the accumulating letters. The milkman would notice the bottles left uncollected on the doorstep. The rector of St. Matthias would inquire about Mrs. Thomas's absence from Sunday service. Kate understood that she had perhaps days, possibly only hours, before the facade of normalcy she was desperately trying to maintain would collapse entirely. The weight of her secret had become unbearable, yet the prospect of confession terrified her even more than the possibility of discovery. She'd heard enough stories of Newgate Prison and the hangman's noose to understand the fate that awaited those convicted of murder in Her Majesty's courts of justice. As the morning light gradually filled the rooms of Mayfield Cottages, Kate Webster stood at the crossroads between confession and concealment, between the weight of truth and the burden of deception. The house around her held its breath, waiting to see which path she would choose, while outside the windows the respectable world of Richmond continued its daily routines, unaware that death had taken up residence in their quiet neighbourhood, wearing the face of an Irish servant girl whose hands would never again be truly clean. The stage was set for the next act in a drama that would captivate Victorian London and echo through the decades that followed, a tale of domestic violence that would strip away the comfortable illusions of suburban respectability and reveal the darkness that could flourish behind even the most proper of facades. Chapter 4. The Hour of Reckoning. The copper pot continued its methodical work through the deepening hours of November's grip on Richmond. Steam rose in ghostly tendrils from the bubbling contents, carrying with it an acrid sweetness that seemed to cling to the very walls of the kitchen. Kate Webster moved about her grim task with the mechanical precision of one whose mind had retreated into some darker corner of necessity, her hands steady now despite the tremor that had seized them earlier. The clock on the mantelpiece marked the progression of minutes with relentless certainty. Each tick seemed to echo through the silence of two Mayfield cottages like the footsteps of approaching judgment. The house itself appeared to hold its breath, as if the very timbers understood the weight of the secret they now harboured. Outside, the November fog had thickened into an impenetrable shroud that muffled the distant sounds of Richmond's late evening stirrings. The lye solution worked its chemical alchemy with patient efficiency. Kate had learned its properties during her years of service, though never before had she applied such knowledge to so terrible a purpose. The caustic substance broke down what flesh and bone could not otherwise be easily disposed of, reducing the substantial to the manageable through the slow violence of dissolution. The process required time and careful tending, like some diabolic cookery that transformed the recognizable into the unrecognizable. As the hours passed, Kate found herself moving between the kitchen and the upper floors of the house with increasing confidence. The initial paralysis of horror had given way to something far more dangerous, a growing sense that her actions might yet go undetected. Julia Martha Thomas had been a woman of rigid habits, yes, but she was also one given to sudden religious enthusiasms that might take her away from Richmond without extensive notice to her neighbours. The bedroom where Julia had met her fate showed little sign of the violence that had occurred there. Kate had worked with methodical thoroughness to remove the evidence of struggle, scrubbing the floorboards with the same lye solution that now bubbled downstairs. The copper pot would serve its purpose, but the physical traces of the deed required more immediate attention. Blood, once dried, possessed an almost supernatural persistence in its ability to betray the guilty. The fog outside had grown so thick that the gas lamps along Mayfield Cottages appeared as mere suggestions of light. Their glow diffused into spheres of amber that seemed to float suspended in the darkness. The effect created an otherworldly atmosphere that suited Kate's purpose well. Few would venture out on such a night unless necessity demanded it, and fewer still would pause to observe the activities of households that appeared quiet and respectable. Mrs. Porter, the neighbour who had witnessed Julia's regular evening constitutional, would likely assume that the fog had kept the older woman indoors. Such weather was notorious for affecting those of delicate constitution, and Julia, despite her robust faith, had shown increasing signs of the frailty that attended her advancing years. The very predictability of her habits, which had once seemed like a potential complication, now appeared to offer a form of protection. The kitchen had taken on the atmosphere of some medieval alchemist's laboratory. Shadows cast by the flickering gas flame danced across the walls in patterns that suggested movement where none existed. The copper pot dominated the space like some ancient cauldron, its contents reducing slowly but inexorably. Kate stirred occasionally, her movements automatic and precise, as if she were preparing nothing more sinister than a particularly complex preserving recipe. Time seemed to move differently in the fog-shrouded hours before dawn. The normal rhythms of the neighbourhood had surrendered to the muffling effects of the November weather, creating a pocket of isolation that felt almost protective. The sounds of Richmond at night, the distant clatter of late carriages, the calls of night watchmen, the occasional bark of restless dogs, all seemed to come from another world entirely. Kate's mind, freed from the immediate demands of her grim work, began to turn toward the practical considerations that would determine her fate. Julia's absence would eventually be noticed, but not immediately. The woman's religious fervour had led her to undertake sudden pilgrimages before, though never without some word to her household. Still, Kate could craft explanations that might serve for a time. A letter received in the Morning Post, perhaps, summoning Julia to tend to a distant relative's spiritual crisis. The house itself seemed to conspire in the deception. Its solid Victorian construction muffled sound effectively, and the fog outside created additional insulation against observation. The very respectability of Mayfield Cottages worked in Kate's favour. It was not the sort of address where neighbours expected drama or violence. The residents were largely elderly, genteel, and inclined to mind their own affairs with the discretion that marked their social class. As the night wore on, Kate found herself cataloguing Julia's possessions with the cool assessment of one already planning their disposition. The woman's jewellery, though not extensive, represented a considerable sum to someone of Kate's circumstances. Her clothing, while sombre and religious in nature, was of good quality and might be altered to serve different purposes. The household silver, modest but genuine, could be converted to currency through the right channels. The transformation taking place in the copper pot required hours to complete, and Kate used this time to begin the systematic erasure of Julia Martha Thomas from the physical world. Personal papers were gathered and sorted, some to be destroyed, others to be preserved for their potential utility in maintaining the fiction of Julia's continued existence. Letters from distant relatives would be particularly valuable, providing templates for communications that might explain her sudden absence. The fog showed no signs of lifting, as the night progressed toward its deepest hour. If anything, it seemed to grow denser, pressing against the windows of the cottage like some tangible presence seeking entry. The effect was both unnerving and reassuring. Unnerving in its suggestion of supernatural observation, reassuring in its promise of concealment. Kate had grown accustomed to reading the weather's moods during her years of service, and she recognised in this fog the sort that might persist well into the following day. The copper pot's contents had been reduced to something far removed from their original form. The lie had done its work with chemical precision, breaking down the recognisable into component parts that bore no resemblance to their source. Kate observed this transformation with the detached interest of one whose survival depended upon the thoroughness of the process. There could be no half measures in such an undertaking. Either the concealment was complete, or it was worthless. The clock marked the passage of time toward the small hours of the morning, that liminal period between night and day when the boundary between the living and the dead seemed thinnest. It was during these hours that the superstitious claimed to see spirits walking, seeking resolution for the circumstances of their departure from the world. Kate felt no such presence in the cottage, but she was aware of a weight in the air that seemed to press down upon her shoulders like invisible hands. The kitchen had grown warm from the steady operation of the gas flame beneath the copper pot. The heat created a microclimate within the room that stood in sharp contrast to the November chill that gripped the world beyond the windows. Steam condensed on the glass panes, creating a further barrier to observation, while adding to the otherworldly atmosphere that seemed to permeate the cottage. As the process neared completion, Kate began to consider the final stages of her concealment. The dissolved remains would need to be disposed of in a manner that aroused no suspicion. The Thames, flowing dark and patient through Richmond, offered one possibility. The river had swallowed countless secrets over the centuries, and one more would scarcely register against its vast indifference. Alternatively, the cottage's small garden might serve, though the risk of later discovery made this option less appealing. The fog continued its silent siege of Richmond, wrapping the riverside community in a shroud of grey that seemed to muffle not just sound but time itself. Within the walls of 2 Mayfield Cottages, Kate Webster worked steadily toward the completion of her terrible task, each action drawing her further from any possibility of redemption, while simultaneously offering the promise of escape from the consequences of her deed. The night wore on toward dawn, carrying with it the weight of secrets that would soon test the limits of human ingenuity and divine justice alike. Chapter 5. The Devil's Chemistry. The copper pot sang its quiet song through the long hours of that November night, its contents reducing slowly in the heat of the coal range. Kate Webster moved through the kitchen of 2 Mayfield Cottages like a woman possessed, her movements mechanical yet urgent, driven by a terrible arithmetic of necessity. The clock upon the mantel chimed 11, then midnight, then 1, marking the passage of time that would never again flow backward to undo what had been done in those moments of rage. The fog pressed thick against the windows, transforming the familiar Holloway road into something alien and otherworldly. Through the glass panes, the gas lamps appeared as dim halos suspended in the mist, their yellow light barely penetrating the November gloom. The world beyond these walls had become distant, muffled, as though the house itself had been lifted from its foundations and set adrift in some grey purgatory between earth and heaven. Kate's hands, stained now with substances that would haunt her dreams, worked with methodical precision. The lie burned at her fingers, eating away at flesh and conscience alike. Steam rose from the pot in twisted columns, carrying with it vapours that spoke of chemistry lessons learned in desperation, of knowledge acquired not in schoolrooms but in the darkest corners of human necessity. The scent hung heavy in the air, acrid and sweet, a perfume of dissolution that would cling to these walls long after the deed was done. The house around her seemed to hold its breath. Julia Martha Thomas's presence, so commanding in life, had left an absence that felt almost tangible. Her morning prayers would go unsaid. her evening rituals unperformed. The Bible upon her bedside table lay open to Psalms, the pages catching shadows from the dying fire in the grate above. The words seemed to whisper in the darkness, speaking of judgment and mercy, of sins that cried out from the earth itself. In the parlour, the grandfather clock continued its steady heartbeat, indifferent to the horror unfolding mere rooms away. Its brass pendulum swung with mathematical certainty, marking moments that could never be recalled, seconds that stretched like hours under the weight of what Kate had unleashed. The house, built in an age when Richmond was still countryside, when the Thames ran cleaner and the air carried the scent of meadows rather than coal smoke, now sheltered secrets that would have made its Georgian builders weep. The kitchen fire crackled and spat, consuming coal with the same hungry efficiency with which Kate's actions had consumed her former life. The flames danced against the blackened bricks of the hearth, casting shadows that seemed to writhe and twist like living things. The copper pot sat heavy upon the range, its contents bubbling with a patience that spoke of processes far older than human law, of transformations that belonged to the realm of natural philosophy rather than the tidy moral categories of Victorian society. Kate's mind raced through the immediate necessities. The neighbours in the adjoining cottages slept soundly, their dreams undisturbed by the chemistry of horror being performed so near their heads. Mrs. Porter next door had retired early, her candle extinguished by 9:30. The Smiths beyond that had been quiet since the children's bedtime stories ended around 8. The fog served as both blessing and curse, muffling any sounds that might have escaped these walls, while simultaneously trapping the house in an isolation that felt increasingly suffocating. The Richmond of 1879 was a place caught between worlds, no longer the rural retreat it had been in the days of the Georges, yet not quite the suburban sprawl it would become in the new century. The Thames still ran wide and relatively clean past the ancient palace, carrying barges laden with coal and timber, with passengers travelling between the great city and the countryside beyond. Gas lamps had replaced the old oil lanterns, but electricity remained a curiosity for the wealthy. Horse-drawn omnibuses clattered along the main roads, their iron wheels striking sparks from the cobblestones, while the great railway engines shrieked their way through the night, carrying commerce and correspondence toward distant destinations. In this world of gaslight and coal smoke, of horsehair and horsehair, Kate Webster found herself trapped in a moment that would define not only her own fate, but the very character of the place where she had chosen to make her stand. The house at 2 Mayfield Cottages, with its modest Georgian facade and neat front garden, had been witness to ordinary lives lived in ordinary ways. Children had been born within these walls, had taken their first steps across these floors, had learned their letters by the light of these same windows. Now it sheltered something that belonged more properly to the penny dreadfuls sold at railway stations than to the respectable neighbourhood where it stood. The copper pot continued its work with mechanical indifference. The contents, which had once walked and talked and prayed, now submitted to the ancient laws of chemistry that govern all flesh. Calcium phosphate and water, proteins and lipids, the basic constituents of mortality reduced to their elemental forms. Kate stirred with a wooden spoon, her movements growing more confident as the night wore on, as though repetition might somehow normalize the unspeakable task at hand. The clock chimed 2 in the morning. Somewhere in the distance a dog howled, its voice carrying across the fog-shrouded streets like a lament for the dead. The sound raised no answering calls, leaving the night to settle back into its oppressive silence. Kate paused in her work, listening to the emptiness that surrounded the house, feeling the weight of isolation that had become both protection and prison. The coals in the grate shifted and settled, sending up a shower of sparks that danced briefly before dying against the blackened bricks. The fire had burned low during the long hours of Kate's labour, but she dared not let it die completely. The work required heat, required the patient application of temperature and time to complete its grim transformation. She added coal from the scuttle beside the hearth, watching as the new fuel caught and blazed, casting fresh shadows across the kitchen walls. Julia Martha Thomas's life had been one of routine and respectability. Morning prayers at 7, breakfast at 8, household management through the morning hours, afternoon calls when weather permitted, evening devotions before retiring at 10. Her world had been bounded by the familiar rhythms of widowed gentility, by the comfortable certainties of faith and social position. The house had been her kingdom, modest but secure, and Kate Webster had been welcomed into it as a servant who might help maintain the order upon which such lives depended. That order now lay shattered beyond repair. The careful routines, the morning prayers, the evening Bible readings, all had been swept away in moments of violence that transformed both perpetrator and victim into something unrecognizable. The house itself seemed to recoil from what it now contained, its very walls appearing to press inward as though trying to expel the horror that had taken root within its foundations. The fog pressed against the windows with increasing intensity, turning the glass panes into mirrors that reflected Kate's haggard features back at her. Her face, lit by the flickering flames from the grate, appeared gaunt and hollow, marked by the strain of the night's work. Her hair, once neatly pinned, had come loose to hang in lank strands around her shoulders. Her dress, practical grey wool chosen for its ability to hide stains, now bore marks that no amount of washing would ever remove. The copper pot sang its quiet song, steam rising in spirals that caught the firelight and dissolved into the darkness above. The contents had reduced considerably during the long hours of heating, the liquid level dropping as water evaporated and carried away its burden of dissolved substances. What remained grew more concentrated, more potent, more terrible in its implications. Kate stirred with mechanical precision, her movement automatic now, driven by a rhythm that had become as natural as breathing. 3 o'clock chimed from the mantel clock, its bronze voice seeming to hang in the air longer than usual, as though time itself had grown reluctant to pass in this place of horror. The night stretched ahead, still hours from dawn, still hours from the moment when ordinary life would resume in the houses around them. Kate found herself caught in a suspension between past and future, between the life she'd known and whatever existence awaited her beyond this terrible threshold. The fire crackled and spat, consuming coal with steady appetite. The flames cast dancing shadows across the kitchen walls, shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources, writhing and twisting like living things caught in perpetual torment. The house creaked and settled around her, its timbers adjusting to the cooling night air, but each sound seemed to carry significance beyond the merely structural, as though the building itself was responding to the weight of secrets it now bore. Outside in the fog-shrouded street, Richmond slept on in peaceful ignorance of the horror being enacted so close to their beds. Tomorrow would bring the usual routines, the morning calls, the afternoon visits, the comfortable patterns of suburban life. But 2 Mayfield Cottages would never again be part of that innocent world. It had crossed a threshold into darkness from which there could be no return, had become a place where the unthinkable had been made manifest in copper and flame, and the patient application of chemistry to questions that should never have been asked. The pot continued its quiet song, steam rising through the darkness toward a dawn that seemed impossibly distant, carrying with it vapours that would linger in the memory of these walls long after the last evidence had been carried away. In the distance, a church bell began to toll, marking another hour in the passage of time that could never be reversed, never be undone, never be made clean again. The night pressed on, patient and inexorable, toward whatever reckoning awaited in the grey November dawn. Chapter 6. The Copper Vessel's Secret. The copper pot held its secrets beneath the surface, where the water had long since turned dark with purpose. Kate Webster moved through the kitchen of 2 Mayfield Cottages with mechanical precision, her hands steady now that the initial shock had passed into something resembling routine. The November cold pressed against the windows, But inside, the fire kept the room warm enough for the work that demanded completion before dawn could expose what the night had witnessed. Mrs. Thomas's kitchen had always been a place of order, where copper gleamed against whitewashed walls and every utensil held its designated place. The widow had taken pride in maintaining her household according to the strict standards of Victorian respectability, each surface scrubbed clean, each pot polished until it reflected the gaslight in perfect circles. Now that same kitchen bore witness to transformations that would have horrified its mistress had she lived to see them. The clock on the mantelpiece marked the passing hours with relentless precision. Each tick seemed to echo through the house, measuring time that could never be reclaimed, marking moments that carried Kate further from any possibility of return to innocence. The fire crackled softly in the range, its flames dancing behind iron grates that had warmed countless evening meals, had heated water for washing, had provided the comfortable domesticity that made a house into a home. Kate had served in many households throughout her years in service, moving from position to position as circumstances demanded or opportunity beckoned. Each kitchen had taught her something new about the intimate machinery of domestic life, the hidden rhythms that kept middle-class households functioning beneath their veneer of genteel propriety. She understood the language of copper and iron, the precise timing required to manage multiple tasks simultaneously, the delicate balance between economy and comfort that governed every household decision. The pot required attention at regular intervals, demanding the careful application of heat and the patient stirring that would ensure complete dissolution. This was chemistry of a sort, though not the kind taught in the universities where learned men gathered to discuss the natural sciences. This was older knowledge, more primitive in its origins, yet no less precise in its requirements. The process could not be hurried, could not be abandoned once begun, demanded commitment to see each stage through to its inevitable conclusion. Outside, the Holloway road stretched away into darkness, connecting this quiet corner of North London to the great metropolis beyond. By day, the road carried traffic of every description, horse-drawn omnibuses crowded with passengers, private carriages bearing the wealthy to their destinations, commercial vehicles loaded with goods bound for the markets of central London. Pedestrians in their thousands walked these pavements, each absorbed in private concerns, unaware of the dramas unfolding behind the respectable facades of terraced houses. But now, in the deep hours of the night, the road lay empty beneath its burden of November fog. The gas lamps created islands of yellow light that barely penetrated the murk, leaving vast stretches of shadow where anything might pass unnoticed. The silence was broken only by the occasional clip of hooves as some late traveller made his way home, the sound echoing off brick walls before fading into the general muffle of the fog. Kate had walked this road many times during her months of service with Mrs. Thomas, carrying market baskets to the shops in Holloway, delivering messages to neighbours, running the countless small errands that comprised the daily business of maintaining a household. She knew every turning, every shortcut, every place where a person might pause to catch breath or shelter from the rain. This knowledge had become precious now, offering possibilities for movement through the district without attracting unwanted attention. The widow's bedroom remained as she'd left it, the bed turned down in preparation for sleep that would never come. Her nightgown lay folded across the coverlet, her prayer book marked at the evening devotions she'd been reading when Kate called her downstairs with some fabricated concern that required immediate attention. The room retained the faint scent of lavender water and the particular mustiness that accumulated in spaces where an elderly person spent long hours in contemplation. Mrs. Thomas had been a woman of precise habits, governed by routines that structured her days from morning prayers through evening devotions. She rose at 7, took her breakfast of toast and tea at 8, devoted the morning hours to correspondence and household management, walked in the garden if weather permitted, received visitors on designated afternoons, dined at 6, and retired by 10 after completing her prayers. These routines had provided the framework within which Kate had learned to anticipate her mistress's needs, to prepare for each day's requirements, to maintain the smooth functioning of domestic life. The kitchen window overlooked the small garden where Mrs. Thomas had cultivated flowers and vegetables with equal attention to order and propriety. Even in November's dying days, the bed showed evidence of careful tending, with late chrysanthemums still blooming despite the frost, and winter vegetables planted in neat rows that would provide sustenance through the cold months ahead. The garden gate opened onto a narrow lane that connected to other gardens, creating a network of semi-private passages that allowed discreet movement for those who understood the geography of domestic spaces. Kate's own history had been marked by movement from household to household, never quite achieving the stability that would allow her to sink roots in any particular place. She had worked for merchants' families in the expanding suburbs, for retired military officers maintaining reduced establishments on half-pay pensions, for widows like Mrs. Thomas who required assistance with the practical aspects of maintaining respectability on modest incomes. Each position had ended for reasons that spoke to the fundamental incompatibility between her temperament and the demands of domestic service. The copper pot demanded another adjustment to the fire, requiring the careful balance of heat that would maintain the necessary temperature without allowing the contents to boil too vigorously. This was delicate work that could not be entrusted to chance, that demanded constant attention despite the late hour and the exhaustion that pressed against Kate's consciousness like a physical weight. She had learned patience in kitchens across London, had mastered the timing required for complex cooking processes, had developed the ability to maintain multiple tasks simultaneously without losing track of any critical detail. Mrs. Thomas had kept detailed household accounts, recording every expenditure in careful copperplate handwriting that spoke to her education and genteel upbringing. The ledgers remained on her writing desk, documenting the modest expenses of maintaining a respectable establishment, payments to tradesmen, wages for domestic help, contributions to charitable causes that reflected her Christian convictions. These records told the story of a life lived according to strict principles of economy and moral duty, each pound and shilling allocated with careful consideration of necessity and propriety. The fire required feeding, demanding the addition of coal that would maintain the steady heat necessary for the work at hand. Kate moved between the coal scuttle and the range with practiced efficiency, understanding the precise amount needed to sustain the fire without creating excessive smoke that might attract unwanted attention from neighbours who maintained their own vigil against the dangers that lurked in London's darkness. The city had taught its residents to notice unusual sounds, unexpected lights, any deviation from the normal patterns of domestic life that might signal trouble requiring intervention. The November fog continued to thicken outside, creating a barrier between the cottage and the watching world that seemed providential in its timing. London fog was legendary for its density and persistence, capable of reducing visibility to mere yards and muffling sounds until the city seemed wrapped in cotton wool. Such conditions provided natural concealment for activities that required privacy, creating temporary refuge from the scrutiny that daylight would inevitably bring. Kate considered the practical problems that dawn would present. Neighbours would expect to see signs of normal household activity, smoke from the chimney, movement behind the windows, evidence of the daily routines that mark the rhythm of respectable life. Mrs. Thomas's absence would eventually require explanation, but for now, in these precious hours of darkness and concealment, there was time to complete the work that would determine all future possibilities. The pot continued its patient work, transforming solid matter into something that could be more easily managed, more completely disposed of, more thoroughly hidden from the investigations that must surely follow once the widow's absence became impossible to explain. This was chemistry applied to the most practical of problems, the ancient knowledge of dissolution and dispersal that had served human purposes since civilization began recording its darkest necessities. As the night wore on toward the grey promise of dawn, Kate maintained her vigil beside the copper vessel that held such terrible secrets. The fire burned steadily, the pot bubbled with mechanical regularity, and somewhere in the distance, church bells marked the passing hours with bronze voices that seemed to whisper of judgment yet to come. Chapter 7. The Anatomy of Concealment. The copper pot sang its terrible song through the darkest hours of that November night, steam rising like departed souls into the rafters of the Mayfield Cottages kitchen. Kate Webster moved with mechanical precision around the cramped space, her movements guided by a desperate clarity that comes only when the mind faces the unthinkable. The firelight cast her shadow large and shifting across the whitewashed walls, transforming her into something monstrous, though she remained a slight woman of 33 years, born to hardship in County Wexford and raised in the bitter schools of London's underworld. The clock in the parlour chimed 11 times, its bronze voice echoing through the house where Julia Martha Thomas would never again hear its call to prayer. The widow's evening routine had been as predictable as the Thames tide, her devotions conducted with the fervour of one who had found solace in Scripture after the loss of her beloved husband. Each night at 10 she would climb the narrow staircase to her chamber, her black bombazine dress rustling against the banister, her prayer book clutched in hands that bore the pale marks of mourning rings. But this night the stairs remained untroubled by her footsteps, and her prayer book lay abandoned on the kitchen table, its leather binding stained with droplets that reflected the gaslight like scattered rubies. Kate had known Mrs. Thomas for merely 6 weeks, yet in that brief span she had catalogued every habit, every weakness, every moment of vulnerability in the widow's ordered existence. The position of domestic servant had come to her through the recommendation of Mrs. Ives, the landlady who let furnished apartments on Hammersmith Road, a woman whose judgment in matters of character would prove fatally flawed. Kate had presented herself as a reformed woman, her previous encounters with the magistrates at Westminster Police Court carefully omitted from her references. The widow, desperate for reliable help in maintaining her modest household, had been eager to believe in redemption, to trust in the possibility that prayer and proper employment might transform even the most wayward soul. The neighbourhood of Richmond had embraced Mrs. Thomas as one of its own respectable widows, those black-draped figures who populated the pews of St. Mary Magdalene Church each Sunday morning, their voices rising in hymns of both mourning and hope. She had taken the cottage on Park Road specifically for its proximity to the church, its view of the ancient common, and its distance from the industrial grime that choked the eastern districts of London. The house itself reflected her character, modest but well-maintained, furnished with the solid mahogany pieces that spoke of middle-class comfort rather than aristocratic excess. Her late husband's portrait gazed down from the mantelpiece, his stern Victorian features softened by the gilt frame that caught the morning light from the parlour windows. Yet beneath the veneer of respectability that characterised Richmond society, darker currents flowed through the narrow streets and terraced houses. The servants who scrubbed the floors and tended the fires of the respectable carried with them the secrets of their employers, the knowledge of debts hidden from neighbours, of correspondence conducted in shadows, of remedies sought from women who dealt in herbs and whispered promises. Kate Webster had navigated these currents since childhood, learning to read the signs of weakness in those who employed her, understanding that respectability was often merely a mask worn to conceal the same hungers and fears that drove the inhabitants of the rookeries. The pot continued its grim work as Kate moved between the kitchen and the scullery, her hands steady despite the magnitude of her task. She had learned efficiency in the workhouses and casual wards, where survival depended upon the ability to complete unpleasant tasks without hesitation or sentiment. The lye she'd procured from the oil and colour shop on Hammersmith High Street served its purpose with chemical indifference, reducing what had been human to constituent elements that could be disposed of without trace. The process was not unfamiliar to her. The slaughterhouses of her youth in Ireland had taught her the transformation that death brings to flesh. the way that what had once breathed and moved becomes mere matter to be processed and forgotten. The fire in the kitchen range demanded constant attention, its appetite for coal and wood growing as the night deepened. Kate fed it with methodical care, understanding that consistency of temperature would determine the success of her endeavours. The flames danced higher with each addition of fuel, casting wild shadows that seemed to dance with malevolent life across the ceiling beams. The heat grew oppressive, forcing her to remove her woolen shawl and work in her cotton shift, her skin gleaming with perspiration that mixed the honest sweat of labour with the cold moisture of fear. Outside, Richmond slept beneath its blanket of November fog, the gas lamps creating pools of amber light at regular intervals along the empty streets. The night watchman made his rounds with unhurried steps, his lantern swinging in lazy arcs as he checked the doors and shutters of the shops along George Street. The Thames moved past the town with ancient patience, its waters carrying the detritus of London toward the sea, indifferent to the small human dramas that played out along its banks. In the distance, the bells of various parish churches marked the progression of hours, their bronze voices calling across the darkness to congregations that slumbered in the confidence of their salvation. The cottage itself seemed to hold its breath as Kate worked through the night hours. The floorboards that had creaked beneath Mrs. Thomas's careful footsteps now remained silent, as if the house understood the gravity of what transpired within its walls. The grandfather clock in the hallway continued its steady rhythm, marking time with the persistence of the mechanical world that operated without regard for human tragedy. The furniture that had been arranged with such care by the widow's own hands now served as silent witnesses to the destruction of the life that had given them purpose and placement. Kate's mind moved between calculation and memory as she tended to her terrible task. She recalled the moment when her relationship with Mrs. Thomas had soured beyond repair, the accusations of theft that had driven her into a rage that now seemed to belong to another person entirely. The widow's voice had been sharp with righteous indignation as she spoke of constables and magistrates, of references that would ensure Kate never again found respectable employment. The words had struck at the deepest fear that haunted those who lived on the margins of society, the terror of being cast permanently beyond the boundaries of legitimate existence. The neighbourhoods of London were mapped not only by streets and squares, but by the invisible boundaries that separated the respectable from the criminal classes. A woman like Kate Webster existed in the liminal space between these worlds, her fate determined by the whims of employers who held the power to elevate or destroy with a few words spoken to the appropriate authorities. Mrs. Thomas had possessed that power, had wielded it with the casual confidence of one who had never questioned her place in the social hierarchy. Now that power had been transferred, violently and irrevocably, to the servant who stood over the bubbling pot with steady hands and racing heart. The chemistry of destruction proceeded with scientific precision through those dark hours. The alkali solution worked its molecular transformation, breaking bonds that had held together the physical form of Julia Martha Thomas, reducing her to components that could be scattered to the winds without recognition or mourning. Kate understood the process not through formal education, but through the practical knowledge of survival, the understanding that comes to those who must dispose of evidence without leaving traces that might lead back to their door. As the cathedral bells of Westminster chimed the midnight hour across the fog-shrouded city, Kate Webster continued her lonely vigil in the kitchen of Mayfield Cottages. The pot sang its chemical song, the fire crackled with greedy appetite, and the November wind rattled the windows with fingers that seemed to seek entry to witness what no human eyes should see. The night stretched ahead with hours yet to pass before dawn would bring the necessity of appearing normal, of maintaining the mask of respectability that would allow her to walk among the living without suspicion. The transformation was nearly complete when the church bells announced the arrival of 1 o'clock, their bronze voices carrying across Richmond with the authority of centuries. Kate wiped her hands on a kitchen towel and surveyed her work with the critical eye of one who understood, that survival depended upon the thoroughness of concealment. The cottage would need to be cleaned with the same chemical precision that had characterized the night's activities, every trace of evidence removed with the skill of one who had learned that society showed no mercy to those who transgressed its fundamental laws. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new performances of innocence that would require all of her considerable talents for deception. But for now, in the small hours of that November night, Kate Webster stood alone with her secret, surrounded by the tools of her concealment and the silence that would become her closest companion in the days ahead. Chapter 8. The Arithmetic of Dissolution. The copper pot had been bubbling for 3 hours when Kate Webster finally allowed herself to rest her stirring arm. The November night pressed against the windows of 2 Mayfield cottages like a curious stranger, while inside the kitchen, the gas flame beneath the vessel danced with tireless devotion to its grim purpose. Steam continued to rise in ghostly spirals, carrying with it the acrid perfume of lye and something far more terrible that Kate dared not name, even in the privacy of her own fevered thoughts. The clock on the mantelpiece chimed 11 times, each bronze note falling into the silence like stones dropped into a well. Kate's hands, raw from the caustic solution, trembled as she wiped them against her apron. The fabric, once pristine white cotton befitting a respectable servant, now bore stains that told a story she could never speak aloud. Her breath came in shallow gasps, fogging the cold air of the kitchen despite the heat radiating from the stove. Outside, the Holloway road lay shrouded in the thick fog that had rolled up from the Thames, transforming the familiar thoroughfare into something otherworldly. The gas lamp struggled against the murk, the yellow flames creating pools of sickly illumination that seemed to emphasize rather than dispel the darkness between them. Occasionally, the distant clip-clop of a late hansom cab would echo through the mist, the sound growing louder as it approached and then fading into nothing, like a memory dissolving into time. The house itself seemed to hold its breath. Upstairs, Julia Martha Thomas's bedroom remained exactly as she had left it that evening, her prayer book still open to the 23rd Psalm, her spectacles folded neatly beside the oil lamp that would never again illuminate her nightly devotions. The bedclothes lay turned back, waiting for their mistress to return from her final earthly journey. But Kate knew, with the terrible certainty that comes from being the architect of tragedy, that those sheets would remain cold and empty through all the nights to come. In the kitchen, the methodical work continued. Kate had learned the principles of dissolution from necessity rather than education, her understanding born of desperation and the peculiar clarity that sometimes accompanies the commission of unthinkable acts. The lye, purchased that morning from the chemist on the high street with coins from Julia's own purse, worked its patient alchemy upon flesh and bone with the same indifferent efficiency it brought to the cleaning of soiled linens. The irony was not lost upon Kate, though her mind recoiled from contemplating it too deeply. She had spent months scrubbing and cleaning in service to her mistress, her hands growing rough from soap and water, her back aching from the endless labour of maintaining respectability. Now she found herself engaged in a different sort of cleaning altogether, one that would erase not merely dirt and stains, but the very evidence of a life lived. The gas jets hissed their soft accompaniment to her labours, the blue flames casting wavering shadows across the kitchen walls. Every surface seemed to watch her with the patient judgment of inanimate witnesses, the copper pots hanging from their hooks, the neat rows of preserving jars, the well-scrubbed wooden table where she had prepared countless meals for a woman who would never eat again. The familiar domestic landscape had been transformed into something alien and threatening, each ordinary object now complicit in her terrible secret. Kate's mind wandered, despite her efforts to focus solely on the task at hand. She thought of her childhood in Ireland, of the cottage where she had been born beneath a thatched roof that leaked when the Atlantic storms drove rain across the green fields. Those had been simpler times when sin and virtue seemed clearly delineated, when the worst transgression might be stealing apples from a neighbour's orchard, or missing Sunday Mass. The girl who had picked wildflowers in the meadows of County Wexford could never have imagined the woman she would become, standing in a gaslit kitchen in London, watching steam rise from a pot that contained horrors beyond naming. The transformation had been gradual, each compromise leading to the next with the inexorable logic of a mathematical proof. First came the lying, small deceptions about her past that seemed harmless enough when weighed against the possibility of honest employment. Then the petty thefts, coins that would not be missed, small items that could be sold or pawned to supplement her meagre wages. Each transgression had made the next seem less significant, until she found herself standing at the threshold of an act so monstrous that it defied comprehension. But necessity, that stern mistress, had driven her forward. Julia Martha Thomas, pious and proper, had discovered the extent of Kate's pilfering. The confrontation had been inevitable, building like a summer storm across the suburban tranquillity of Richmond. Words had been exchanged, threats made, and in that moment of crystalline rage, Kate had seized the axe that lay beside the kitchen hearth, raised it high and brought it down with all the fury of her accumulated resentments. The deed, once done, could not be undone. The mathematics of murder demanded solutions to problems that proper society never contemplated. A body required disposal, evidence needed elimination, and time pressed forward with its relentless demands. Kate had discovered reserves of practicality she never knew she possessed, approaching the aftermath of her crime with the same methodical attention she had once brought to the weekly washing. The pot continued its patient work, the lie breaking down what violence had created. Kate stirred mechanically, her arm moving in the rhythm she had learned from years of preparing soup and stew for her mistress. The motion was familiar, almost soothing, though the contents of this particular vessel bore no resemblance to any meal that had ever graced a Christian table. Steam continued to rise, carrying with it the last physical remnants of Julia Martha Thomas, transforming solid matter into vapour that would dissipate into the November night like incense from a devil's altar. The church bells of Richmond chimed midnight, their bronze voices carrying across the fog-shrouded Thames. The sound seemed to mock Kate's situation, reminding her that while she laboured in darkness, the righteous slept peacefully in their beds, secure in the knowledge that they would wake to face another day of ordinary sins and common pleasures. She envied them their innocence, even as she despised them for the ease with which they moved through a world that had shown her no such mercy. As the night deepened, Kate found herself thinking of Julia Martha Thomas not as a victim, but as an adversary finally defeated. The older woman had represented everything Kate would never be, could never attain. Born to comfort, educated to refinement, secured by the marriage to a man of property, Julia had possessed all the advantages that fortune denied to Irish peasant girls with quick tempers and light fingers. Her piety had been genuine but galling, her charity real but condescending. She had looked upon Kate with the sort of benevolent concern that the comfortable reserve for the unfortunate, never understanding that such sympathy could cut deeper than outright cruelty. The kitchen clock marked the passing hours with methodical precision, each tick bringing Kate closer to the moment when her terrible work would be complete. She had calculated the requirements carefully, estimating the time needed for the lie to accomplish its dissolution, planning the disposal of the remaining liquid with the sort of attention to detail that would have impressed her former mistress had it been applied to less horrific purposes. Every aspect of the process had been considered, from the acquisition of materials to the final cleaning that would restore the kitchen to its usual spotless condition. Dawn was still hours away when Kate finally judged her work complete. The pot, which had bubbled with such patient persistence through the long night, now contained only a dark liquid that bore no resemblance to anything that had once drawn breath or offered prayers. She allowed the flame beneath it to die, watching as the blue tongues of gas flickered and expired, leaving only the pale light of the kitchen's single lamp to illuminate her labours. The silence that followed seemed profound after hours of bubbling and hissing. Kate stood motionless beside the stove, her hand still gripping the long wooden spoon she had used for stirring, her mind struggling to comprehend the magnitude of what she had accomplished. Somewhere between sunset and sunrise, she had erased a human life as completely as if Julia Martha Thomas had never existed at all. The thought should have brought satisfaction, or at least relief, but Kate felt only a curious emptiness, as if the process of dissolution had claimed something essential from her own being. Outside, the fog was beginning to lift, revealing the familiar outlines of the Holloway road. Soon, the legitimate world would stir to life, servants lighting fires and preparing breakfast, tradesmen loading their wagons, respectable citizens beginning another day of lawful existence. Kate would need to present herself among them, to wear the mask of innocence with the same skill she had once applied to her other deceptions. The kitchen would be cleaned, the pot scoured, the evidence of her night's work eliminated as thoroughly as she had eliminated its cause. But first she allowed herself a moment of stillness in the gathering pre-dawn quiet. The house around her seemed different now, as if the removal of Julia Martha Thomas had somehow altered its essential character. The rooms that had once echoed with prayers and proper conversation would fall silent. The daily rhythms of respectable domestic life would cease, and Kate herself would become the temporary custodian of a dwelling that had been transformed from home to tomb to empty shell in the space of a few dark hours. The approaching dawn promised new challenges, fresh deceptions that would need to be crafted and maintained. But for now, in these final moments before the world awakened to discover what had been lost in the night, Kate Webster stood alone in the kitchen of Mayfield Cottages, surrounded by the implements of her terrible success, waiting for the sun to rise on a world that would never again contain Julia Martha Thomas. Chapter 9. The Copper Cauldron's Secret. The copper pot sang its terrible song through the midnight hours, steam rising like incense in some profane chapel. Kate Webster moved through the kitchen of 2 Mayfield Cottages with the methodical precision of one who had crossed a threshold from which there could be no return. The gas lamps flickered against their glass chimneys, casting her shadow large and wavering against the papered walls where Mrs. Thomas had once hung her collection of pressed flowers from happier days in Richmond. Outside, November's grip tightened upon the Holloway road. Frost etched delicate patterns across the window panes, each crystal formation catching the lamplight like tiny stars fallen to earth. The fog that had rolled in from the Thames at twilight now lay thick as lamb's wool across the sleeping neighbourhood, muffling the occasional clatter of late carriages returning from London's theatres and supper rooms. In this cocoon of mist and darkness, Kate's grim work continued undisturbed. The clock upon the mantelpiece marked each passing quarter hour with brass chimes that seemed to echo through the house like accusations. 11:30, 11:45. Midnight arrived with the distant tolling of church bells across Richmond, their bronze voices carrying over the frost-touched rooftops where chimney smoke rose straight as candles in the still air. Kate paused in her stirring, listening to those bells as they announced the transition from one day to the next. From the ordinary Tuesday, when Julia Martha Thomas had drawn her last breath, to this Wednesday, that would dawn upon a world forever changed. The contents of the pot had begun to reduce, the vigorous bubbling of earlier hours now settling into a gentler simmer. Kate had added more lye, purchased that very morning from the chemist's shop on the high street with coins from Mrs. Thomas's own purse. The irony was not lost upon her, though she pushed such thoughts away as she tended to her macabre cooking. The scent that filled the kitchen was indescribable, sweet and acrid at once, mingling with the coal smoke from the range and the lingering aroma of the evening supper that had gone uneaten. In the parlour beyond, Mrs. Thomas's favourite chair sat empty, its worn velvet cushions still bearing the impression of her slight form. Her needlework lay abandoned on the small table beside it, a half-finished altar-cloth for St. Bartholomew's Church, where she had worshipped faithfully every Sunday for the past 3 years. The thread spelled out the beginning of a biblical verse in careful golden letters. "The Lord is my shepherd. The The irony hung in the air like smoke, for the shepherd had not protected his lamb when the wolf finally came calling. Kate's hands, red and raw from the caustic solution, continued their grim labour. She had removed her apron hours ago when it became too stained to salvage, working now in her plain brown dress with the sleeves rolled above her elbows. Her dark hair, usually pinned neatly beneath her cap, hung loose about her shoulders, dampened by the steam that rose continuously from her unholy cauldron. She looked like some figure from medieval folklore, a kitchen witch brewing death in the small hours when decent Christians lay sleeping. The fire beneath the pot had been fed throughout the night with coal from Mrs. Thomas's own scuttle, each lump chosen carefully to maintain the steady heat required for her task. Kate understood the chemistry of destruction, knowledge gleaned from her years in service where she had witnessed the cleaning of bones for soup stock, the rendering of fat for candles and soap. But this application of such mundane skills filled her with a horror that she fought to suppress, focusing instead on the practical necessities of her situation. Beyond the kitchen windows, the world continued its oblivious slumber. In the terraced houses that lined Mayfield Cottages, families lay warm beneath wool blankets, husbands and wives side by side, children curled in their narrow beds dreaming of tomorrow's lessons and games. None suspected that death had visited their quiet street, that one among their number would never again join the morning parade to market or pause for gossip at the garden gates. The clock struck 1. Kate wiped her forehead with the back of her wrist, leaving a streak of moisture that gleamed in the gaslight. Her back ached from bending over the pot. Her arms burned from the heat and the lie, but she dared not stop. Dawn would come in a few hours, and with it the necessity of presenting a normal face to the world. The milkman would arrive at 6:30, as he had every morning for the past year. The postman would knock shortly after 7, bringing Mrs. Thomas's correspondence from her sister in Wales and the religious tract she subscribed to from London publishers. The coal fire crackled softly, consuming itself as it had done countless times before in this very grate. Kate remembered mornings when she had built up this same fire while Mrs. Thomas still slept upstairs, the routine comfort of domestic duty before the day's inevitable friction began. Those mornings seemed to belong to another lifetime now, separated by an unbridgeable chasm from this midnight vigil of destruction. She stirred the pot's contents once more, noting how the mixture had thickened and darkened. The chemical process was nearly complete, the lye having done its inexorable work through the long hours of November night. Soon there would be nothing left but a residue that could be disposed of quietly, anonymously, leaving no trace of what had transpired in this kitchen that had once been the domain of simple meals and ordinary conversations. The gas flames danced behind their glass shields, casting shifting patterns of light and shadow across the tiled floor where Kate's feet had grown numb from standing. She thought of other kitchens she'd known in her years of service, other pots she'd stirred over other fires. In great houses and modest ones she had prepared countless meals, cleaned endless dishes, maintained the heartbeat of domestic life that kept the world turning. But never had she imagined that her hands would be employed in such work as this, that her knowledge of heat and time would serve such a purpose. The wind outside had begun to rise, rattling the window frames and moaning softly through the bare branches of the elm tree that stood sentinel in Mrs. Thomas's small garden. The sound was mournful, like voices from some distant realm of sorrow, and Kate found herself listening to it as she worked. Perhaps it was the voice of judgment, or perhaps merely November asserting its dominion over the sleeping earth. 2 o'clock came and went, marked by the faithful chimes of the mantelpiece clock and the more distant bells of Richmond's churches. Kate's world had narrowed to this single room, this single pot, this single terrible task that consumed her attention like a fever. She had passed beyond fear now, beyond remorse, into a state of mechanical functionality that allowed her to continue when a more sensitive soul might have collapsed beneath the weight of what she was doing. The copper gleamed dully in the gaslight, its surface filmed with condensation from the steam that continued to rise from its depths. Kate had inherited this pot from her previous position, a parting gift from a cook who had taken pity on the young Irish woman with ambitious plans and limited prospects. How that kindly woman would have wept to see her gift put to such use, to know that her generous gesture had become an instrument of concealment in the aftermath of murder. The fire needed tending again, and Kate bent to add more coal, feeling the heat wash over her face like the breath of some infernal furnace. The flames leaped higher for a moment, illuminating the kitchen in hellish orange before settling back to their steady glow. She returned to her stirring, mechanical and rhythmic, as if she were preparing some ordinary dish for the next day's dinner. In the streets beyond, a few early workers began their journeys toward London's factories and warehouses, their footsteps muffled by the fog that still clung to the cobblestones. The crossing sweeper who worked the corner of Holloway Road and Seven Sisters would soon take up his broom, earning his daily bread by clearing paths for the boots and skirts of better-dressed pedestrians. The world was stirring toward another day, indifferent to the horror that had unfolded within the walls of two Mayfield Cottages. Kate's reflection wavered in the pot's curved surface, distorted and strange, like some phantasm conjured by the steam. She hardly recognised herself in that fractured image, saw instead some creature of darkness that bore only passing resemblance to the woman who had arrived at Mrs. Thomas's door 18 months ago with a letter of reference and hopes for steady employment. That woman seemed as distant now as childhood, separated by the immeasurable gulf of what she had become. 3 o'clock brought the first hint of dawn's approach, though darkness still held dominion over the November morning. Kate could sense the world's subtle shift toward daylight, the almost imperceptible change in the quality of shadow and silence that heralded the coming of another day. Soon she would need to bank the fire, dispose of the pot's contents, and transform herself once more into the grieving servant who would discover her employer's mysterious disappearance. The thought of that performance filled her with a weariness that seemed to penetrate her very bones. She would need to summon tears to craft a story of confusion and concern that would satisfy the questions that would surely come. The police would arrive, neighbours would gossip, Mrs. Thomas's few remaining relatives would demand answers, and through it all, Kate would need to maintain the facade of innocence, her terrible knowledge locked away like some poisonous secret in the depths of her heart. The copper pot continued its patient work, reducing and dissolving, erasing the physical evidence of Julia Martha Thomas's final moments on earth. But Kate knew with growing certainty that some stains could never be washed clean, that some fires burned beyond the reach of water or lye. The real work of concealment would not end with the emptying of this pot, but would continue for days and weeks and perhaps years to come, a burden she would carry like some medieval penitent bearing stones upon her back. As the clock struck the quarter hour, Kate Webster stood alone in her transformed kitchen, stirring the last traces of her victim into oblivion, while the world prepared to wake to a day that would never see Julia Martha Thomas alive again. The gas flames flickered lower now, their work nearly done, and in their dying light, the shadows seemed to whisper of judgment yet to come. Chapter 10. The Silence of Judgment. The dawn of March 20th, 1879, broke grey and cold over Wandsworth Prison, its pale light filtering through the narrow windows of the condemned cell where Kate Webster sat in her final hours. The stone walls seemed to absorb the weak sunlight, leaving only shadows and the steady drip of condensation from the ceiling above. Outside, the city of London stirred to life, unaware that justice would soon claim its due for the terrible crime committed in the kitchen of 2 Mayfield Cottages. The chaplain had visited twice during the night, his black robes rustling against the flagstones as he offered prayers for the salvation of a soul that had committed the unthinkable. Kate had listened in silence, her hands clasped in her lap, the same hands that had wielded the axe and stirred the copper pot on that November evening when Julia Martha Thomas's life had ended in violence and horror. The words of scripture echoed in the narrow cell, but they seemed to bounce off the walls like bird wings against glass, finding no purchase in the darkness that had consumed her heart. The warders moved through their morning routines with practiced efficiency, their footsteps echoing down the long corridors of the prison. They had seen many condemned souls meet their fate upon the scaffold, and they recognized the signs of a woman resigned to her destiny. Kate Webster had fought vigorously for her life throughout the trial, maintaining her innocence even as the evidence mounted against her like stones upon a grave. But now, in these final hours, a strange calm had settled over her features, as if she had finally accepted the terrible weight of what she had done. In the nearby village of Richmond, the residents of Park Road went about their daily business, though many still crossed themselves when they passed number 2 Mayfield Cottages. The house stood empty now, its windows boarded shut, the garden overgrown with winter weeds. Local children dared each other to approach the gate, but none lingered long in the shadow of those walls that had witnessed such horror. The very air around the cottage seemed heavy with memory, as if the stones themselves remembered the screams that had pierced the November night. Mrs. Porter, the elderly neighbour who had first noticed Julia's absence, continued to attend services at the local church, though she spoke little of those terrible weeks when the mystery had consumed the neighbourhood. She had testified at the trial with trembling hands, recounting the last time she'd seen Julia Martha Thomas alive, walking home from evening service with her prayer book clutched to her chest. The image haunted her dreams, that final glimpse of a woman who had no idea that death waited for her in the form of her trusted servant. The investigation had unravelled Kate Webster's deception thread by thread, revealing a pattern of lies and theft that stretched back months before the murder. Detective Inspector Pearce had worked tirelessly to piece together the evidence, following the trail from the Thames where body parts had been discovered to the pawn shops where Julia's jewellery had been sold. The copper pot, that instrument of unspeakable horror, had been recovered from a rag and bone man who had purchased it unknowing of its grim history. When the truth emerged of how it had been used, even hardened policemen had struggled to maintain their composure. The trial had transfixed London, filling the newspapers with details that shocked even those accustomed to the dark underbelly of Victorian society. The prosecutor had painted a picture of calculated brutality, describing how Kate had murdered her employer in a fit of rage after being dismissed for theft, then spent days disposing of the body with methodical precision. The defence had argued for manslaughter rather than murder, claiming the killing had been unpremeditated, but the jury had seen through the evidence to the cold planning that had followed the violent act. Young John Church, the boy who had lived at Mayfield Cottages during those terrible days, had given testimony that sealed Kate's fate. His description of the strange smells emanating from the kitchen, the unexplained fires burning late into the night, and Kate's nervous behaviour had provided crucial pieces of the puzzle. The child's innocence had protected him from understanding the full horror of what he had witnessed, but his words carried the weight of truth that no legal argument could dismiss. As the morning hours passed in the condemned cell, Kate Webster received her final meal with little appetite. The bread tasted of ash in her mouth, the weak tea providing no comfort to her troubled spirit. She had written letters during her imprisonment, some to family members who had disowned her, others to clergymen pleading for spiritual guidance. The responses had been few, for the nature of her crime had placed her beyond the pale of ordinary human sympathy. The gallows stood ready in the prison yard, its wooden frame stark against the grey sky. The executioner had arrived before dawn, a professional man who went about his grim business with practiced efficiency. He had adjusted the rope with careful precision, ensuring that justice would be swift and certain. The trapdoor beneath the platform had been tested repeatedly, its mechanism oiled and checked until it operated with the reliability that such solemn work demanded. Outside the prison walls, a small crowd had gathered despite the early hour and bitter cold. They came not from bloodlust, but from a sense that history was being made, that the conclusion of this terrible case marked something significant in the annals of crime and punishment. Among them stood reporters from the major London newspapers, their notebooks ready to record the final chapter of a story that had captivated and horrified the nation. The clock in the prison tower began its slow climb toward 8 o'clock, the appointed hour when justice would be served. In her cell, Kate Webster rose from her narrow cot and smoothed her simple dress with hands that barely trembled. The chaplain appeared at her door one final time, his face grave with the weight of his duties. Together they walked the short distance to the scaffold, their footsteps echoing in the narrow corridors like the tolling of a funeral bell. The prison yard was silent except for the whisper of wind through the bare branches of the trees beyond the walls. Even the guards maintained a respectful quiet, understanding that they were witnessing the final act of a tragedy that had begun with trust betrayed and ended with life taken in payment for life lost. The executioner waited with professional patience, his face masked by the solemnity of his office. Kate Webster mounted the scaffold with steady steps, her eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the prison walls. She had declined to make a final statement, perhaps recognizing that no words could undo the horror she had brought into the world. The rope was positioned with practiced care, the hood drawn down to spare the witnesses the final moments of earthly justice. At precisely 8 o'clock, the church bells of London began to toll the hour, their bronze voices carrying across the sleeping city like a prayer for the dead. In Richmond, in the shadow of the empty cottage on Park Road, shopkeepers opened their doors to another day of ordinary business. Children walked to school along the same streets where Julia Martha Thomas had taken her final journey home from evening prayers. The trapdoor opened with mechanical precision, and Kate Webster passed from the world of the living into whatever judgment awaited beyond. Her death brought no resurrection to Julia Martha Thomas, no healing to the families torn apart by violence, no easy answers to the questions that such terrible acts raise about the darkness that can lurk in human hearts. It brought only the cold satisfaction of justice served and the hope that such horrors might be prevented by the certainty of consequence. The crowd dispersed quietly, returning to their homes and workplaces with the knowledge that the Richmond murder case had reached its inevitable conclusion. The newspapers would run their final stories, analysing every detail of the crime and its aftermath. Legal scholars would debate the case for years to come, using it as an example in discussions of criminal law and the nature of evidence. But in the end, the story belonged not to the lawyers or the journalists or the crowds who had followed every development. It belonged to Julia Martha Thomas, a woman of simple faith whose trust had been rewarded with betrayal, whose kindness had been met with violence, whose life had been cut short by the very person she had tried to help. She lay now in her grave in Richmond Cemetery, her headstone bearing witness to a life lived in service to others and ended far too soon. The cottage on Park Road remained empty for months after the execution, its rooms silent and still. Eventually new tenants would move in, drawn by the reasonable rent and convenient location. They would sweep the floors and polish the windows, hang fresh curtains and plant new flowers in the garden. Life would return to the space where death had once held dominion, as it always does in the endless cycle of human existence. Yet those who knew the history would sometimes pause as they passed the cottage, remembering the woman who had died within its walls and the servant who had betrayed her trust so completely. The story would become part of the neighbourhood's folklore, passed down through generations as a cautionary tale about the dangers that can lurk behind familiar faces. In the records of Scotland Yard, the case file was closed and archived, another solved mystery in the endless catalogue of human crime and punishment. Detective Inspector Pearce moved on to other investigations, carrying with him the memory of one of the most disturbing cases of his career. The physical evidence was stored away or destroyed, but the knowledge of what had transpired could never be entirely erased from the consciousness of those who had witnessed its unfolding. The Thames continued its ancient flow toward the sea, carrying away the detritus of human ambition and folly as it had for centuries before and would for centuries to come. The river had yielded its grim secrets during the investigation, surrendering the remains that had led to Kate Webster's capture and conviction. Now it flowed on in silence, its waters reflecting the changing sky and the eternal passage of time. As evening settled over London once again, gas lamps flickered to life along the Holloway road, their warm glow pushing back the gathering darkness. In the distance, church bells marked the passing hours as they had on that November night, when Julia Martha Thomas had walked home for the last time. The city settled into its nightly rhythm of rest and watchfulness, secure in the knowledge that justice had been served and order restored. The candle burned low in the prison chapel where the chaplain completed his final prayers. The chamber fell silent save for the whisper of wind through the stone corridors, and history once again turned the page in the dark.